To speak more about this, climate activist Happy Khambule is a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Change Commission. He joins us via Zoom to share his observations. So what are your thoughts about that, Mr. Khambule? The UN Secretary General speaking of COP26 with a certain naivete, he said, or naive optimism that the world exhibited. But he, in the same token, talks about sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. So are we or are we not closer to achieving our emissions targets?
Good evening. Well, it's really an indication as well as a signal to the world that we are really not addressing the problem, right? And the problem is that we are on track to having 1.2 degrees worth of warming. So we've got 0.3 degrees to go to reach 1.5, which we're supposed to not even go above. But with the trajectory that we're going in, by 2050, we're going to have about 2.7 to 2.8 degrees worth of warming. And that's really worrisome, because for Africa, and particularly countries like South Africa, you always have to double that type of temperature increase from the average.
Now, just I'd imagine the jargon is all very familiar to you who are part of these talks, the commissions that you're in, the activists that you interact with, but what do you and I, the layman, need to do if we're going to help reach these targets? And perhaps give us a sense of what you're talking about when you talk about 2 degrees. Because I saw a study saying that, for instance, that we were expecting an increase of about 14% of global emissions in the 2020s, but energy-related CO2 emissions grew by 6% to their highest levels in history in that time.
Yeah. So what we're talking about really is that every decision that we make, whether to switch on the light, whether to drive a car or not to drive a car, the decisions that impact or are derived from our energy infrastructure, from our food infrastructure, really have an impact on the living environment that we are in. So what we're supposed to be doing, you and I, is really starting to make decisions in our personal life that reduce the amount of impact that we have on the environment, but at the same time, start to push policies as well as world leaders to make more ambitious targets. Because when the targets are more ambitious and when the policies are being developed, when the laws are being put in place, we start to see the changes. So not only do governments start to do things differently, but also companies start to act differently and start to talk about their own responsibility in relation to climate change outside of just the individual choices that people can make as consumers. But what we are talking about really is that we'll start to see more extreme weather events. We will start to see slow onset situations such as droughts becoming more severe, where you have precipitation like rain happening in a more erratic fashion, happening at the wrong times of the season, as well as becoming more intense when it happens and becoming less visible or less available when it is required. So having water scarcity or as a condition of our country is going to become even worse. But then we also have the other impacts that we are not usually feeling. For example, like cyclones coming inland from the ocean.
I mean, I think it's the International Energy Agency that's saying that countries should actually even start devising policies that ensure that people drive slower on the highway, or reduce kilometers per hour that people can drive on the highway. So that's, I would dare say, you and I having the privilege to be mindful of a decision like that. But somebody who is an informal settlement and lacks power to keep warm during winter, the kind of fossil fuels that they need to cook, to even ensure that they don't die from the cold. What do governments need to do there in terms of intervention?
Well, we're lucky that we've got options that are available, right? So we know that we don't just use coal just for electricity. We can use it for other things, but we don't need to use it solely for electricity because we've got other technologies that can allow us to reduce our carbon emissions, deal with water scarcity that a lot of the fossil fuels that we use tend to use, and also reduce particulate matter, which is an air pollution issue. In doing that, we are able to bring in technologies that address problems such as energy poverty. But the point of the matter is that when the IEA or the United Nations Framework Convention or any intergovernmental agencies speaks to the switches that need to happen, they tend to speak being mindful of the fact that some countries are going to take time to get to a point where they will be net zero by 2050, or to a point where they are totally decarbonized their electricity sector. So we will have to undertake a just transition, a transition that will allow us to address our social ills, the main fundamental challenges that we have, whilst addressing the climate problem. So if a person like most of us in South Africa, we don't really have a choice either to use Eskom, which is a coal-dependent utility, we would start to see an introduction of new technologies that start to wean us off this fossil fuel-based utility, whether it's Eskom itself starting to deploy renewables, whether it's the different companies around Eskom trying to also produce electricity, selling it directly to us, or otherwise, we are going to have to start using the different technologies that address the primary problem. And that's the direction we should be going. But it's not fast enough to ask us to do less of using cars or using electricity, because if we don't change the actual infrastructure, we're going to be stuck in the same problem.
So South Africa in particular has said, we've heard this recently from our minerals minister, in the greater energy mix and trying to achieve this just transition. We can't ignore coal as a part of that, even though we are trying to reduce reliance on it. But Greenpeace calls it, I think, the dirtiest, most polluting way of producing energy. And talking about the coal combustions, the kind of emissions that come out of it, particulates and nitrogen oxides, etc., etc. But when we're explaining this, because we want to groom generations that have a healthier understanding with their environment, and some things we lived with for so long that we actually don't realize emanate from that, whether it's the illnesses. I mean, we're talking about the environment itself, but talk to us about just the harmful uses of some of these emissions in closed spaces.
So there are direct implications for using fossil fuels. Let's say, for example, if you are heating a house with coal, or you're using paraffin, or you're using coal to cook as well, the direct implications to your health are much more evident than when it's being done at a bigger scale, right? So in the house, you cooking yourself in there with all the particulate matter, with the SOx and NOx, with any other dirty metal that is coming from the fossil fuel combustion process. But what tends to happen then is that at a bigger scale, we are unable to literally hone in and say this is the direct implication of coal use. But what we can see is that there's evidence that those who are living close to certain pockets of fossil fuel dependent industry tends to have certain ailments as well as certain consequences to their health, which tends to be more respiratory than they are like flesh-based or anything like that. So what is starting to happen is that companies are starting to take those matters seriously, because we've got technologies that can abate the harmful effects at a larger scale. And the most direct way in which we can deal with the impacts of using fossil fuels inside the house when you are directly burning them or using them is to move away from using those and start to use alternative fuels, which are largely going to be electricity based, right? You have electricity to facilitate all the things that you need to get done. So if we know where the problem is, which is there's still people who are using these fossil fuel-based kinds of fuels in-house, where there's indoor pollution, which is very dangerous. We should be moving them away. That's why we've got this thing called an integrated national energy plan or universal access to electricity, because we already knew before 1998 that this is a problem. So we have to get everyone onto electricity as soon as possible. Then added to that is that as people move away from using these direct fossil fuels in their houses, is that the actual energy system that we have in South Africa starts to move away from the very same thing that we were using to facilitate energy access, by changing the technologies as well as ensuring greater efficiency in terms of the fuels we're using. And to be honest, the minister is very correct to say that coal is still going to be part of the mix of South Africa's energy infrastructure or electricity infrastructure, but that doesn't mean that it's going to stay like that all the time, right? Because we are moving away from it. It used to be that it was 99% or 95%, but now we're talking about in the regions of 90 to 88% of the entire electricity mix is actually being generated by coal, where the balance is being generated by a bit of nuclear, a bit of renewables of solar and wind, as well as pumped hydro.
But we need to move faster, is what you're saying. The Secretary General also highlighting the immediate fossil fuel supply gap, which will be as a result of the conflict in Europe. How worried are you? Because developing countries are going to be much dependent, given the rising costs of fuel, of food, of other supply chain services?
Well, we should be worried in general that things are going to get more expensive when even the UN starts to say that we're going to have problems, right? We've already seen what the fuel increases have done to our to our food basket in South Africa and directly at the fuel pump. But I mean, it's one of those situations where you start to see that actually this thing that we're using is great in order to get us going, to make us productive, but it is not the thing that we should be using all the time. We should start to look at other alternatives. So, for example, in South Africa, we still have a problem where some of our own refineries, the ones that we have, are all going to shut down, making us more exposed to the international markets and also volatility around oil use. And that means that we won't be refining our own products. That has also knock-on impacts. But that doesn't mean that our actual use of fossil fuels shouldn't go down. Countries like Germany and other European countries are looking towards removing themselves from being dependent from oil and gas that is coming from Russia. So is the United States. We ourselves aren't that exposed that much, except for other products that are coming from that region. It would be maybe a better option for us to start thinking about what we need to do in the locality of the Southern African region, where we can get other resources. But this is an opportune moment, just like COVID also presented to us, to make that transition, to move away, starting to electrify more of our transportation, starting to move towards moving most of the freight onto the rail, where we can electrify it and make sure that we're using less oil products, but then at the same time making sure that the energy security that we need is being realized without being so exposed to international development.
All right. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights. Climate activist Happy Khambule, he is a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Change Commission.